Shut your mouth. You're just a low-class logistics clerk. Don't embarrass me here. My husband Richard hissed through clenched teeth, his manicured fingernails driving into my bicep until the skin split open and bled. Right in the middle of the defense banquet hall, surrounded by 400 of the most powerful military and corporate elites in Washington, the man I had endured for 15 years publicly stripped me of every shred of dignity I had left. He allowed his millionaire friends to mock my boring desk job, slapping my worth right across the face just to bury his own humiliating failure at the military entrance exams 20 years ago. He was utterly ashamed of the presence of his freeloading wife. Standing next to him, his accomplice Daniel Evans refused to meet my eyes, cowardly biting his lower lip to swallow the truth he knew but would never speak. I bowed my head, sliding my hands deep into my pockets to hide the bullet and burn scars carved across every knuckle, locking the freezing, killing intent behind the darkness of my lowered gaze. Richard laughed with sadistic satisfaction, but that arrogant man had absolutely no idea that in exactly 60 seconds of countdown, when that top-secret name was called from the podium, all 15 of the most powerful generals in the Pentagon would simultaneously snap to attention and salute me. Before I tell you what happened, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if the story resonates with you. Also, let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is where you are. The sharp, searing sting of Richard's fingernails digging into my bicep faded into the throbbing ache of an old, jagged bullet scar, buried deep beneath my ribs. I traced the timeline backward to early that morning, to the suffocating silence of our bedroom, right after the harsh, violent slam of the front door. My husband had left for his corporate empire, but his presence remained a physical weight crushing the oxygen out of the room. The air was thick with the sickeningly sweet stench of his expensive cologne, a calculated mask he sprayed on every morning to cover the rotting insecurity of his failed military past. 20 years ago, Richard washed out of the armed forces physical exams, a permanent emasculating stain on his ego that never healed. To survive that shame, he constructed a psychological prison for me, forcing me to play the role of his pathetic low-level logistics clerk while he paraded around Washington, pretending to be the dominant force in our marriage. I sat completely motionless in the dim room, running my thumb across the raised scar tissue on my ribs. I did not cry. I locked into a 4-count tactical breathing rhythm, methodically slowing my heart rate, feeling the phantom pain of my battlefield wounds, merging with the fresh bruises he had gifted me that morning. The oppressive silence shattered. A single ultra-low frequency vibration rattled across the heavily scratched vanity table. My military-grade encrypted communication device lit up its pale glow, cutting through the darkness like a surgical blade. I reached out my calloused fingers, flying across the screen, inputting the 16-character alphanumeric decryption sequence purely through muscle memory. A secure text message materialized on the black screen from my loyal subordinate Major Sarah Miller. Colonel, all security protocols for tonight are complete. You will officially be awarded the Shadow Shield. We are so proud of you. I stared at the glowing white letters, the faint reflection of my hollow eyes staring back at me from the glass surface. Sarah was a fierce, lethal operator. I vividly remembered the coppery smell of blood and burning sand the night I dragged her broken body out of a collapsing terrorist compound under heavy enemy crossfire. She worshipped the ground I walked on, and her absolute loyalty was the only barrier stopping her from personally executing my husband for his constant treasonous disrespect. I had explicitly forbidden her from intervening. Not out of mercy for Richard. Out of operational discipline, I locked the device, casting the room back into absolute darkness. The second I allowed my eyelids to flutter shut, it attacked. The deafening, earth-shattering roar of artillery fire and the agonizing screams of my fallen squad mates tore through my brain like shrapnel. My fingers seized the wooden bed frame so hard the joints turned white, and the wood groaned under the pressure. My PTSD was an apex predator, constantly hunting me in the quiet moments of peace, dragging me back to the blood-soaked sand and the bodies of the brothers and sisters I could not save. For 15 long years, I had deliberately used my husband as a civilian anchor, a desperate, pathetic tether to a normal life. I willfully accepted his daily gaslighting and physical intimidation because the sharp, immediate pain of his cruelty grounded me in the present. It was a tangible, manageable pain, far easier to process than the suffocating guilt of surviving the battlefield, when so many of my operators did not come home. On the battlefield, I was surrounded by brothers and sisters who would die for me without hesitation. In my own bedroom, I was entirely isolated, actively punished by the one man who was supposed to protect me. I needed his abuse to feel human. That was the sickest truth I had ever swallowed. I forced myself out of the chair and stood directly in front of the full-length mirror. I unbuttoned my collar, running 2 fingers over the raised, ugly scar tissue sneaking across my collarbone like a road map of every classified mission I had survived. Every venomous insult my husband hurled at me was a desperate, calculated strike at his own cowardice. I was the terrifying monster he could never become, so he needed me weak, submissive, and broken to validate his false superiority. I reached for a bottle of cheap foundation, applying a thick layer over my pale, battle-hardened skin, constructing the pathetic, invisible facade of an inventory clerk. I rolled my shoulders backward, deliberately burying the lethal, explosive muscle density beneath a shapeless, dull sweater. I slipped a pair of unassuming glasses over my predatory eyes. The woman staring back at me in the mirror was a ghost. A carefully manufactured lie designed to keep a coward comfortable. The battlefield for tonight's operation was already set in motion, and the time for hiding in the shadows was rapidly approaching its expiration date. By late morning, I found myself engulfed by the plush, oversized leather chair of an ultra-exclusive, ridiculously overpriced salon in the heart of the capital. The atmosphere was actively hostile, saturated with the cloying synthetic aroma of imported essential oils and the hollow rapid-fire chatter of bored millionaires desperately proving their worth to each other. Chloe, a young stylist with exhausted eyes and trembling hands, gently worked on my unkempt, practical hair. She was the only human being in the room whose eyes did not immediately calculate my net worth the second I walked through the door. The rest of the women operated like a synchronized pack of starving wolves, their gazes darting across the mirrors, constantly hunting for the weakest link in the room to tear apart and consume. I sat perfectly still, my sine spine aligned against the back of the chair, cataloging the exits and assessing the structural vulnerabilities of the room. A deeply ingrained habit that refused to die no matter how many years of civilian camouflage I layered over it. I folded my hands neatly in my lap, hiding the calluses, built from years of close-quarters combat. From the corner station, my husband's colleague's wife, Jessica Collins, glared at my reflection with undisguised disgust. Her psychological anchor was a crippling, paralyzing terror of aging. She had discovered a microscopic new wrinkle near her eye that morning, and her desperate need to assert dominance over someone weaker drove her fangs straight into my quiet presence. She tilted her chin toward her sycophant friend Monica, her voice projected loud enough for the entire salon to absorb. She shouldn't have shown her face in high-class places like this. Monica immediately giggled behind a manicured, diamond-ringed hand eager to feed off the cruelty. Jessica leaned back, crossing her legs with theatrical superiority. Look at her pathetic, sour look. She's just a low-class logistics clerk, clinging to the military's skirt to leech off our tax money. Chloe's hands instantly froze in my hair, her breathing hitching, as she darted nervous, apologetic glances between me and the wealthy predators circling the room. I closed my eyes, regulating my breathing into the steady, methodical rhythm of a sniper, awaiting final authorization to pull the trigger. On the blood-soaked sands of 3 different continents, I had stared down the cold black barrels of hostile combatants and felt the concussive blast of mortar fire rattle my teeth loose. These petty venomous insults landed like mosquito bites against reinforced Kevlar. I did not flinch. I did not open my mouth to justify my existence or defend my honor. I logged their profound psychological weaknesses into my mental dossier, with the cold efficiency of an intelligence officer building a target package. My silence was not submission. It was the chilling, calculated restraint of a predator watching its prey dance on the edge of a cliff they could not see. Let them bark. The louder they screamed to prove their superiority, the more they exposed the hollow, rotting core beneath their designer clothes. I adjusted my folded hands slightly, feeling the rough, callous ridges press against each other. The suffocating tension in the room shattered at the sudden sharp clink of fine porcelain violently striking a glass table. In the secluded VIP corner, Evelyn Hayes, the formidable wife of the senator, slowly lowered her teacup. Evelyn possessed the terrifying eyes of a seasoned political butcher, the kind of woman who could strip away every layer of pretense with a single glance. She utterly despised the uneducated loud nouveau riche who polluted her social circles. Evelyn leaned back into the velvet cushions, a chilling predatory smile curving her lips as she surveyed the sycophants who had just exposed their own stupidity. "How fascinating," Evelyn stated, her voice slicing through the salon like a scalpel through infected tissue. "Real lions never bother to roar at a pack of hyenas yapping away because of their own weakness." The salon plummeted into a deathly horrified silence. Jessica's face drained of all color, her Botoxed features freezing in sheer unadulterated panic as she realized she had just been intellectually slaughtered by a woman whose phone call could vaporize her husband's entire career. Monica physically shrank into her chair, gripping the strap of her designer purse like a life raft. I calmly stood up, paid Chloe directly in crisp cash, pressing the bills firmly into her trembling palm, and walked toward the exit without a single backward glance. The absolute silence following Evelyn's verbal execution was suffocating and glorious. Jessica stared down at her lap, her manicured hands shaking, too terrified to breathe loudly enough to draw attention back to herself. Monica nervously adjusted and readjusted the strap of her purse, physically trying to disappear into the leather cushions. I calmly zipped up my plain, unremarkable winter jacket, executing a final visual sweep of the exits before stepping toward the heavy glass doors. I vastly preferred to operate in the absolute shadows, completely unseen and untraceable. But the looming presence of Evelyn Hayes, in the same room, confirmed a terrifying reality. The political elite were already circling the board, moving their chess pieces into position for tonight's endgame. My heart maintained its icy, steady beat, but my mind rapidly calculated the variables of the impending collision. My bare hand gripped the freezing brass handle of the exit. The heavy glass door violently swung open from the outside before I could push it. A brutal blast of freezing winter wind swept directly into the overheated salon, instantly killing the scent of essential oils, and carrying with it the unmistakable crushing aura of high military command. Victoria Sterling, the formidable wife of the JSOC commander, stepped inside. Her posture was forged in decades of strict military discipline, her spine perfectly straight, her chin held at the exact angle of someone accustomed to standing beside the most powerful men in the Department of Defense. The frivolous chatter of the salon died for a second time, replaced by the heavy reverence that genuine authority commands without asking. Victoria quickly scanned the room for her designated stylist, but her sharp, hawkish gaze abruptly locked onto my reflection in the massive wall mirror. She stopped dead in her tracks, her eyes narrowing as her brain rapidly processed the facial recognition data. My heart rate spiked by a single involuntary tactical beat. 2 grueling years ago, I had crossed paths with her in a highly classified subterranean Pentagon corridor. I had just stepped out of an interrogation room, still reeking of burnt cordate sweat and the dried blood of a violent extraction. Her eyes widened slightly now, as she visually dissected my pathetic civilian disguise, desperately trying to place the terrifying ghost from her memory into this bright, sterile salon. Victoria took 2 deliberate steps directly into my path, firmly cutting off my only exit route. Behind us, Jessica and Monica physically leaned in, practically vibrating with malicious excitement, hungrily waiting for me to humiliate myself by admitting my low-level status to a general's wife. "Excuse me, you look very familiar," Victoria interrogated her, tone perfectly polite, but laced with the undeniable crushing authority of a woman who had spent 30 years commanding rooms full of decorated officers. "Which department do you work for in the Pentagon?" Is it in the staff area? I stopped walking. My spine instantly and instinctively aligned into perfect rigid military posture. The transformation took less than a second, but it was seismic. I looked dead into Victoria's eyes, flawlessly matching her dominant energy without a single shred of hesitation or fear. I calmly adjusted the collar of my cheap jacket, leaning in slightly so my voice would only carry to the necessary targets. Task Force Echo, I stated, delivering the 3 classified words with lethal freezing precision. I did not wait for a dismissal. I did not wait for her brain to fully process the magnitude of the revelation. I executed a sharp, flawless military pivot and walked straight out the door, dissolving into the freezing wind and the chaotic anonymity of the busy street. Behind the glass, Victoria Sterling stood completely paralyzed, her face turning chalk white with absolute staggering shock. The wife of the most powerful special operations commander in the United States military had just come face to face with the phantom colonel who led the most classified task force in the Pentagon. Disguised as a salon customer in a shapeless sweater, in the far corner, Evelyn Hayes clapped her hands exactly twice in slow, rhythmic amusement, her predatory smile widening as she signaled to no one but herself that the hunt had officially begun. Evening descended. The grand foyer of the Metropole Hotel was a blinding, aggressive sea of crystal chandeliers and gold leaf trim. The air hung thick, suffocating with the scent of roasted meats, expensive perfumes, and sheer political desperation. Richard marched at slightly ahead of me, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles twitched beneath his skin as he aggressively adjusted his bespoke tuxedo. He relentlessly muttered complaints about my minimalist black dress under his breath, venomously calling it a cheap, pathetic rag compared to the haute couture gowns flowing past us on the arms of the general's wives. His memory anchor was a deeply buried, festering shame. His snorts needed me to look exactly like the low-level invisible clerk he claimed I was, because standing next to a subservient woman was the only way his fragile, shattered ego could feel like a dominant force. I maintained my 360 degrees visual scan of the perimeter, categorizing the concealed weapons of the Secret Service details positioned at every entrance, completely ignoring his pathetic whining, while silently calculating the exact structural weak points of the room and the number of steps between me and every exit. From the glittering crowd, Ethan Wright materialized like a rat smelling a feast, his face instantly plastered with a sickeningly sweet, exaggerated smile of utter subservience directed entirely at Richard. Ethan's psychological anchor was a dark, starving childhood in extreme poverty. He was utterly terrified of slipping back down the social ladder, making him viciously punch down at anyone he perceived as lower class to secure his false status among the elite. Spotting me trailing behind my husband, Ethan's eyes flashed with predatory malice. He aggressively stripped off his heavy, ostentatious fur coat and violently tossed it directly into my chest, forcing me to catch the dead animal weight or be struck across the face. "Take this, and while you're at it, go get Mr. Jackson a martini," Ethan ordered, his voice dripping with loud theatrical condescension, projected high enough to ensure the surrounding executives witnessed his dominance over the boss's wife. Richard watched the interaction unfold with a dark, approving smirk, his silence validating his assistant's cruelty like a king watching his court jester perform. 2 executive wives standing nearby covered their mouths and tittered behind their champagne flutes, exchanging the satisfied glances of hyenas, watching a lion being forced to carry a carcass for them. The weight of the fur coat was obscene, 30 pounds of dead animal, and vanity pressing against my arms like a physical manifestation of every degrading task Richard had assigned me over 15 years. Carry my coat, fetch my drink, shut your mouth, know your place. Standing slightly behind the grinning duo was Daniel Evans, the vice president. The moment the heavy coat hit my arms, Daniel rapidly averted his eyes violently, staring down at his phone screen as if his life depended on whatever was displayed on it. Daniel's memory anchor was the terrifying blood-soaked night I shattered the jaws of 2 armed robbers with my bare hands to save his pathetic life in a dark college alleyway. He knew exactly what kind of lethal, highly trained apex predator I actually was. He had seen the monster with his own eyes, watched me move through violence with a speed and precision that no logistics clerk could ever possess. Yet his paralyzing cowardice and his desperate greed for the corporate promotion chained him to Richard's side, a willing accomplice in the degradation of the woman who had saved his life. Daniel swallowed hard, a visible bead of cold sweat forming on his temple. His left hand twitched half an inch toward me, an involuntary reflex of guilt, before he jerked it back and shoved it deep into his pocket. He actively chose silent complicity over courage, while Ethan openly humiliated me. I stood perfectly still, holding the dead weight of the fur, draped over my left arm, as a lethal sub-zero aura of pure killing intent bled from my absolute stillness and radiated outward like a shockwave from a detonation. Ethan instinctively took half a step backward, his primal survival instinct suddenly warning him of the invisible danger of pulsing from my posture, even though his conscious mind could not identify the source. I forcibly suppressed the trained urge to snap his wrist in 3 places, methodically adjusting the heavy coat over my forearm with the cold discipline of a soldier disarming an explosive device. The dense crowd of millionaires parted. Evelyn Hayes, the senator's wife, glided past our group in a stunning evening gown that probably cost more than Ethan's annual salary. Richard immediately puffed out his chest, stepping forward with a blinding fake smile, desperately hoping to catch her attention. Evelyn completely ignored his existence, looking through him as if he were a pane of dirty glass. She stopped directly in front of me, and in full view of every corporate executive within 30 feet, she executed a deep, highly respectful, and profoundly deliberate bow. Richard and Ethan stared in slack-jawed, paralyzed horror, their brains short-circuiting at the sheer impossibility of the most powerful woman in Washington, D.C., bowing to a warehouse clerk. Daniel's face drained of every drop of blood, his phone nearly slipping from his sweating fingers. I maintained my cold, stoic expression, my eyes fixed forward, letting their arrogance rot into utter unadulterated terror right there in the glittering ballroom. Not a single word was spoken. None were needed. The timeline snapped violently back to the present, colliding with the exact moment the nightmare at the dinner table had ignited. We were seated at table 4, the designated pit for the corporate executives, positioned far away from the VIP section, where the real power in the room resided. The sharp, lingering pain of Richard's fingernails, digging into my bicep from the foyer, merged seamlessly with the escalating hostility, brewing across the white tablecloth. Marcus Jenkins, the chief financial officer, his face flushed an ugly crimson from downing 2 consecutive glasses of dry wine on an empty stomach, leaned forward aggressively. His psychological anchor was a burning, festering shame. His only son had catastrophically failed the Special Forces psychological evaluation, bringing perceived dishonor crashing down on his wealthy family name. To cope with that failure, Marcus actively degraded the entire military apparatus, tearing down soldiers to soothe the wound his own bloodline had inflicted on his pride. He pointed a thick manicured finger toward the reserved general seating near the stage where rows of decorated uniforms gleamed under the chandelier light. Look at those guys wearing medals. They're all just a bunch of cold-blooded, useless soldiers who only know how to kill using our tax money. Marcus spat his voice loud, grating and dripping with venom. They're glorified just because they know how to pull a trigger. He threw back a 3rd glass of wine, his lips twisted into a grotesque sneer of superiority. The temperature in my veins plummeted to absolute 0. The bustling noise of the banquet hall faded into a high-pitched ring as the faces of my dead operators, young men and women who had taken bullets for the flag and bled out in my arms on foreign soil, flashed violently behind my eyes. Corporal Davis, 22 years old, who died shielding a civilian child with his own body, Sergeant Ortiz, who dragged 3 wounded teammates 200 YD through enemy fire before a sniper round punched through her neck. I leaned forward, my jaw tightening like a steel vise, opening my mouth to correct his fatal miscalculation. Richard anticipated my defiance before I could form the first syllable. He instantly slammed his heavy hand onto my thigh beneath the table, his nails digging into the exact same bruised flesh as before, grinding the pain deeper. Shut your mouth. There's no place for a warehouse inventory clerk to speak here. Richard hissed, his eyes wide with manic superiority, terrified that my voice would ruin his networking opportunities with the generals he was desperately trying to impress. Across the table, Ethan smirked like a satisfied jackal, his chin lifted with theatrical triumph. Jessica aggressively rolled her eyes, scoffing at my audacity for even thinking about opening my mouth. Daniel Evans aggressively bit his lower lip until it whitened, staring at his untouched steak, drowning in his own complicity. They were a collective rotting tumor of arrogance feeding off each other's cowardice. The rusty, toxic, psychological anchor that had chained me to this abusive marriage for 15 agonizing years violently snapped in half. I felt it break, not in my mind, in my chest. A physical sensation like a steel cable giving way under impossible tension. I did not raise my voice in a hysterical argument. I did not beg for respect. I did not cry. My right hand resting casually on the pristine tablecloth instinctively contracted, with the lethal grip strength of a close-quarters combat specialist who had strangled armed hostiles in pitch-black rooms. Crack. The heavy, expensive crystal to glass in my grip shattered into 100 jagged, razor-sharp fragments under sheer, unadulterated physical force. The deafening pop of the glass silenced table 4 instantly. Every single person at the table flinched backward in sheer primal terror. Thick crimson blood immediately pooled in the center of my palm, dripping rhythmically onto the pristine white silk tablecloth. Drip, drip, drip. The visceral reality of the blood shattered their superficial bubble of champagne and self-congratulation. The jagged glass fragments embedded in my palm glinted under the chandelier light like shrapnel lodged in flesh. Richard yanked his hand off my thigh, as if my skin had turned to molten steel. Marcus physically recoiled from the table, knocking over his 4th glass of wine, the crimson liquid pooling and mixing with my blood on the white silk in a grotesque watercolor. Jessica covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes bulging with genuine primal fear for the first time all evening. Clara Jenkins, Marcus's wife and the only woman at the table, possessing a functioning conscience, gasped in genuine wide-eyed horror and immediately reached for a cloth napkin to stem the bleeding, her maternal instincts overriding the social code of silence. I raised my bleeding hand, halting Clara's frantic advance, with a single unyielding authoritative gesture, a gesture that carried the weight of 1,000 battlefield commands. I stood up slowly, deliberately, the legs of my heavy wooden chair scraping loudly against the polished marble floor like a drawn blade. I did not grant Richard the mercy of eye contact. Looking at him now felt like looking at the corpse of a relationship that had been dead for a decade, but kept breathing through the life support of my own fear. His psychological control over my mind was entirely dead, evaporated into the tense air of the dining hall, along with the last traces of his cologne that I would ever tolerate. I turned my back on the table of paralyzed cowards and marched with heavy, calculated strides toward the restroom. The blood continued to drip from my clenched fist, leaving a trail of red droplets across the ballroom floor. Each drop was a period at the end of a sentence I had been writing for 15 years. The illusion of my pathetic civilian life was officially terminated. The countdown to the total annihilation of their arrogance had been initiated. If you have ever had to physically shatter your own limits just to silence the toxic voices of those who were supposed to protect you, please take a second to like this video. Your support is my greatest ally. So, share in the comments the exact moment you finally decided to walk away from a broken relationship. In the sterile, echoing silence of the marble restroom, I held my lacerated right hand under the freezing high-pressure stream of the automatic faucet. The icy water stung with a viciousness that felt almost alive, washing away the bright crimson blood and the very last remnants of my civilian weakness in a swirl of pink that spiraled down the stainless steel drain. I watched the diluted blood disappear, feeling a profound, terrifying sense of clarity lock into place behind my eyes, like the scope of a rifle settling onto a confirmed target. Using my teeth and my left hand, I tightly wrapped a pristine white linen handkerchief around the deep cuts, pulling the knot tight until the bleeding was completely stemmed by the crushing pressure. I looked snorts up at my reflection in the wide mirror. The woman staring back was no longer a battered, exhausted wife, begging for the crumbs of domestic peace. The hollow look was gone, replaced by the hyper-focused, lethal stare of a special operator, preparing for a mission from which there would be no quiet return. I adjusted the cuffs of my black dress, concealing the makeshift bandage beneath the fabric. My left hand gripped the cold marble edge of the sink. I flexed my fingers once, twice confirming full dexterity despite the lacerations. The cuts were superficial. I had field sutured worse on my own thigh, in a bombed-out building in Fallujah, with nothing but a sewing needle and dental floss. I pulled my shoulders back, rotated my neck until the vertebrae popped, and turned toward the heavy restroom door. The woman who walked out of that restroom was not the same woman who had walked in. The battered wife had bled out into the sink. The was operational. The evening schedule advanced like a well-oiled military operation. The elite guests were ushered through metal detectors and into the central top-secret auditorium, secured by heavily armed military police, carrying assault rifles with the casual readiness of professionals who had used them in combat. I bypassed the designated corporate seating entirely and took a tactical position in the dark, unlit shadows near the back wall, leaning my shoulder blades against the cold concrete. From the darkness, my eyes instantly locked onto the illuminated podium at the front of the cavernous hall. Several rows ahead, I spotted Richard and Ethan. They were practically crawling over the velvet seats, craning their necks and vibrating with the desperate, pathetic need to worship power they could never earn. They were surrounded by 4-star generals and defense contractors entirely out of their depth, but desperately pretending to belong, adjusting their civilian ties with the nervous, clumsy hands of men who had never worn a uniform a single day in their lives. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere of absolute military authority hung over the room like a thunderhead, a permanent reminder of the true cost of the freedom these executives so casually enjoyed while sipping champagne and calculating profit margins. I counted the armed guards, 12 visible, at least 4 more concealed in the elevated observation positions flanking the exits. Standard high-value event protocol, my protocol. A massive LED screen, ignited behind the podium, displaying redacted black and white satellite footage of covert raids, shadows of operators breaching compounds, helicopters descending into hostile territory. The grainy silhouettes of my Tier 1 teams executing missions that would never appear in any newspaper. Ethan violently grabbed Richard's tailored sleeve, his eyes wide dilated with manic, unadulterated greed. His childhood terror of poverty was temporarily eclipsed by the intoxicating scent of billions of dollars in defense contracts. He leaned into my husband's ear, practically hyperventilating. "Unbelievable, Mr. Richard. Can you imagine how terrifying tender holds?" Ethan whispered, his voice cracking with the raw excitement of a starving man staring at a banquet table. "If we could get acquainted with them, the corporation stock would skyrocket." Richard nodded furiously, a predatory, sickening grin stretching across his face as he actively fantasized about shaking hands with a military legend and monetizing the connection. They were already plotting how to exploit the blood and sweat of my unit. They had absolutely no idea that the phantom commander they were hungrily scheming to manipulate was the exact same woman they had, physically and verbally abused 20 minutes earlier, at table 4. The auditorium lights plunged into total darkness. Admiral Thomas Reed, a man whose chest was heavily armored with decades of combat ribbons, stepped up to the microphone, his silhouette cutting a sharp figure against the massive illuminated screen behind him. His deep, commanding voice demanded, and received absolute pin-drop silence from every soul in the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight, we are here to honor an outstanding individual, someone who has commanded a series of operations to protect our national security." Reed's voice echoed off the acoustic walls, filling the cavernous space with the gravity of a declaration of war. "This year's Shadow Shield Award goes to the mysterious commander of the top secret Special Task Force Echo." The screen violently flashed with heavily redacted combat reports, thick red stamps covering the casualty lists and operational details, that would remain classified for another 50 years. The statistics scrolled rapidly across the display. 300 international hostages rescued, 5 transnational terror networks entirely annihilated, 12 high-value targets neutralized. The entire auditorium collectively held its breath, the tension pulling tight like a piano wire stretched to its breaking point, every pair of eyes scanning the shadows for the phantom to step into the blinding stage lights. I shifted half a pace out of the darkness, my bloody bandaged hand resting casually by my side, ready to execute the final devastating maneuver of a 15-year operation. Admiral Reed broke the heavy, expectant silence, lifting a heavy gold-sealed envelope into the blinding glare of the stage lights. He swept his gaze across the VIP section, letting the tension coil to its absolute breaking point. Every general in the front row leaned forward. Every politician gripped the armrest of their seat. And now, I cordially invite our brilliant commander to step up to the podium. Reed's voice boomed over the colossal sound system, echoing through the hall like a synchronized barrage of artillery fire. He paused, letting the silence scream, then looked directly toward the darkened back wall where I stood waiting. Colonel Amber Jackson, commander of Task Force Echo. The words struck the auditorium with the concussive force of a detonating thermobaric weapon. For one agonizing frozen heartbeat, the entire world stopped spinning. In the fourth row, Richard's manic, greedy grin instantly wiped off his face like chalk in a rainstorm, replaced by a grotesque mask of raw confusion. His brain desperately struggled to process the identical match between the legendary commander's name and the wife he had just ordered to shut up and fetch a martini, as if triggered by a hidden, electrified tripwire. Every single general in the front row, including JSO Commander Arthur Sterling, shot to their feet simultaneously. Their polished boots clicked in perfect, terrifying unison against the marble as they snapped into rigid attention, throwing up sharp, crisp salutes toward the shadows where I stood. 15 of the most powerful military leaders in the United States of America, men who commanded armies and authorized strikes that reshaped the geopolitical map, stood at attention for their colonel. That visual confirmation violently severed Richard's grip on reality. The memory anchor of his humiliating failure at the military academy 20 years ago came crashing down from the ceiling of his subconscious, entirely crushing his fragile ego under the suffocating weight of his wife's actual rank. He staggered backward, his face rapidly draining of all blood until it was the color of dirty ash before he collapsed heavily into his chair, violently gasping for oxygen like a fish, ripped from water and thrown onto hot concrete. Beside him, Ethan Wright's mouth hung open, in silent frozen terror. The crystal wineglass slipped from his trembling fingers and shattered explosively on the marble floor, the sharp sound cutting through the silence like a gunshot. Daniel Evans aggressively buried his face in his sweating hands, his shoulders trembling uncontrollably, as 15 years of cowardice finally caught up to him in the span of a single heartbeat. I stepped out of the protective darkness and walked deliberately down the center aisle. Every single step I took possessed the heavy, rhythmic, earth-shaking cadence of a commanding officer walking into a hostile combat zone. The elite, corporate crowd parted instinctively, physically shrinking back into their seats as they felt the crushing atmospheric pressure of my unmasked presence bearing down on them like a weather front. I unwound the blood-soaked linen handkerchief from my lacerated hand, casually tossing the crimson-stained cloth onto an empty chair as I passed. I was leaving the physical and emotional stains of my pathetic civilian suffering behind forever. Every drop of blood I had shed at table 4 was the final payment on a debt I never owed. Marcus Jenkins watched me pass with the wide, glassy eyes of a man who had just realized he had mocked the dead comrades of the most lethal woman in the building. Jessica Collins pressed herself so far back into her chair that the wood creaked. Clara Jenkins was the only person at table 4 who met my eyes, and she gave a single small trembling nod of acknowledgement that carried more courage than anyone else at that table had shown all evening. I ascended the carpeted stairs to the brightly lit stage. I looked Admiral Reed directly in the eye, offering a crisp, flawless salute, which he returned with deep, visible reverence, before placing the heavy gold medal of the shadow shield around my neck. The weight settled against my chest like a second heartbeat. I turned slowly, gripping the edges of the podium with both hands, my bandaged right palm pressing flat against the polished wood, and locked my predatory gaze dead onto the pathetic, shrinking form of my husband cowering in the fourth row. I adjusted the microphone. The feedback whined briefly before my voice cut through the cavernous hall like a sharpened blade, carrying into every corner, every shadow, every guilty conscience in the room. For 15 years I've lived under the guise of a logistics clerk, enduring the disdain of a man who constantly called me useless just to cling to a fake peace after the traumas of war. I stated the brutal, unvarnished truth with the steady, unwavering delivery of a battlefield debrief, exposing his domestic abuse to the most powerful people in the nation. I let the words settle, watching Richard physically shrink in his chair as 400 pairs of eyes turned toward him with the collective weight of judgment. But today I declare Colonel Amber Jackson has awakened. I no longer need to cling to manipulation to anyone's rusty anchor to survive. The lives of my comrades and the peace of this nation are what I truly dedicate myself to. The hall exploded. It was not just applause. It was a deafening, thunderous roar of absolute vindication that physically shook the floorboards beneath my boots. Generals pounded their fists on their armrests. Politicians rose to their feet. Civilian guests wiped tears from their faces. Richard was completely, utterly destroyed, buried alive under the sheer crushing volume of my undeniable glory. His mouth opened and closed repeatedly, but no sound came out. The corporate mask he had spent 2 decades sculpting had been publicly torn off and incinerated. Ethan hyperventilated beside him, his face drained to the color of wet cement, already calculating the catastrophic implications for his own career, now that his boss's wife had turned out to be his boss's commanding officer. Daniel could not even lift his head from his hands. His shoulders shook with silent, wrenching sobs that he tried and failed to muffle against his sweating palms. Victoria Sterling, the JCS commander's wife, rose from her seat in the VIP section, her chalk-white face from the salon now replaced by an expression of fierce, unwavering pride. She had finally connected every piece of the puzzle. The devastating aftermath of my speech sent literal shockwaves of chaos, rippling through the elite corporate crowd. Unable to physically bear the crushing, suffocating weight of absolute public humiliation, Richard scrambled desperately out of his chair, knocking over glasses and shoving past frozen bodies as he lunged toward the side exit, attempting a cowardly retreat into the shadows. He did not make it. A solid, impenetrable wall of Secret Service agents instantly materialized in his path, their hands resting on the concealed weapons beneath their jackets. Richard violently bounced off an agent's chest and stumbled backward onto the polished marble. Senator William Hayes and his formidable wife, Evelyn Hayes, stepped out from behind the security detail. Evelyn's eyes burned with a righteous, unadulterated fury as she looked down at the trembling, pathetic man trying to flee the consequences of his own cruelty. She fixed him with a stare that had silenced committee rooms full of hostile senators. "So this is the foolish husband who constantly degraded the great woman who saved my son's life," Eleanor stated coldly, her razor-sharp words stripping away the very last lingering shreds of his false corporate dignity. Richard choked on his own breath, his lungs refusing to cooperate, his legs buckling slightly as the weight of Eleanor's words registered. Every corporate contact, every political handshake, every networking dinner he had spent 15 years building was vaporizing in real time. The executives who had laughed at his jokes 30 minutes ago were now pressing their backs against the walls, physically distancing themselves from the toxic radiation of his collapse. The senator himself did not even bother to look at him. Richard was not worth the effort. He was already a ghost in their world, a cautionary tale that would be whispered about in boardrooms for decades. From the flickering shadows of the exit corridor, Evelyn Hayes glided out, her lips curled into a terrifying predatory smirk that promised no mercy and no escape. She had been watching, she had been waiting. Every chess piece she had positioned throughout the evening was now locked into checkmate. A little mouse actually thought he could cage a lion, Evelyn observed loudly, her voice carrying across the stunned crowd with theatrical precision, driving the final nail into his psychological coffin. You should feel lucky she hasn't snapped your neck with her bare hands, Richard. The crowd parted instinctively as I descended the stage stairs and marched directly toward him. I did not speak a single word. I did not need to. I reached out my calloused, bloody hand, grabbing the silk lapels of his insanely expensive tuxedo, the fabric crumbling under my grip. Like tissue paper, with a violent, effortless surge of trained physical strength, I shoved him backward, throwing him bodily through the heavy glass doors and out onto the deserted, wind-swept balcony. He hit the concrete floor, hard, his elbows scraping against the rough surface, his tuxedo jacket splitting at the shoulder seam. From the impact, the freezing winter wind instantly attacked his panicked, sweating face, and the temperature difference between the heated auto horneters and the exposed balcony was so severe that his breath erupted in thick, visible clouds of vapor. The city glittered far below, indifferent to his suffering. I stepped through the doorway and stood over him, my feet planted shoulder-width apart in a combat stance, blocking his only route back to the warmth and safety of the auditorium. The glass doors sealed shut behind me with a heavy final thud. The city stretched out below us, a glittering void of lights and darkness, and the wind howled between the buildings, like the voice of every comrade I had buried. Richard scrambled backward across the freezing concrete, like a cornered rat, his designer shoes scraping uselessly against the icy surface. The heavy glass door opened again behind me. Daniel Evans marched onto the freezing balcony. The terrifying, undeniable reality of my lethal power had finally shocked him into growing a spine, shattering the memory anchor of cowardice that had chained him for 20 years. His jaw was set, his eyes red, his breathing ragged but resolved. He ripped his vice president ID badge from his chest, the heavy plastic snapping off the lanyard with a sharp crack, and threw it forcefully at Richard, hitting him directly in the chest. The snort's badge bounced off and clattered across the concrete. I resign, Richard. Daniel declared, his voice shaking but resolute, every word carrying the weight of 2 decades of suppressed guilt. I've been too cowardly, standing by while you trampled the woman who saved my life. This farce is over. Daniel turned his back on his former master and walked away from the balcony, choosing his soul over his salary for the first time in 20 years. His footsteps were heavy, but accelerating the gait of a man fleeing from the burning wreckage of a life built on cowardice. He pushed through the glass doors and disappeared into the warm light of the auditorium without a backward glance. And I knew with absolute certainty that he would spend the rest of his life trying to earn back the respect he had forfeited in that dark college alleyway when I had fought for him, and he had repaid me with silence. Near the crack of the door, Ethan Wright had collapsed onto his hands and knees on the polished marble. The sycophant was weeping hysterically, snot and tears streaming down his contorted face, loudly begging the armed military guards for mercy, utterly terrified that the military would arrest him, or worse, for his earlier insults against a decorated colonel. His childhood terror of poverty had been replaced by something far more immediate: the raw animal fear of a man who had just realized he had thrown his coat at a special operations commander and ordered her to fetch drinks. The guards stared down at him with the cold, disgusted expressions of men who had actually earned their place in the world. Not a single one extended a hand to help him up. I stood silently over Richard, who was now curled into a pathetic, shivering ball on the freezing concrete, looking exactly like the terrified failure he was 20 years ago when the military examiner handed him his rejection letter. The arrogant corporate king was gone. The bespoke tuxedo was dirty and torn. The manicured hands were scraped raw from the concrete. The dominant, sneering voice that had degraded me for 15 years was reduced to a broken, whimpering gasp. Without a single flicker of hesitation or pity, I raised my bruised left hand and slowly slid the heavy gold wedding band over my swollen knuckle. The metal caught on the joint for a fraction of a second, then came free. I held the ring out over the edge of the high-rise balcony, my arm extended fully into the howling wind, staring down into the pitch-black, bottomless abyss of the city streets far below. Richard's bloodshot eyes widened in primal, desperate terror as he watched the final symbol of his control dangling over the void. "All your pride, your hypocrisy, it's all garbage," I stated with chilling, absolute finality. "This rusty anchor is broken." I opened my fingers. The ring fell. It caught the faintest glint of light from the auditorium windows as it tumbled end over end, shrinking rapidly until it was nothing more than a speck, and then nothing at all, swallowed by the suffocating darkness of the city below. 15 years of enduring his fists, his words, his cologne, his manufactured superiority, his cowardly need to cage me. All of it compressed into a tiny circle of gold that was now falling toward the earth at 32 feet per second squared. The exact same acceleration as a spent shell casing ejecting from a rifle chamber, permanently severing the chain that had kept me tethered to a man who never deserved a single day of my sacrifice. I turned on my heel and walked back into the blinding warm light of the auditorium, into the arms and salutes of my true brothers in arms, leaving the shattered, crying remains of my abusers rotting in the cold dark. 3 months passed. The ghost of that freezing balcony wind faded from my skin, replaced by the warm, blinding golden sunlight flooding through the reinforced floor-to-ceiling windows of my newly assigned corner office at JSOC headquarters. The massive room was bathed in brilliant morning light, a stark, deliberate contrast to the oppressive, suffocating gloom of the civilian house I used to share with Richard. I stood tall in my heavily decorated class, a military uniform. The silver eagles pinned sharply to my shoulders gleamed in the sunlight, and the thick, colorful rows of combat ribbons on my chest told the story of every mission, every scar, every brother and sister I had fought beside. I was no longer hiding behind the invisible, pathetic camouflage of a logistics clerk. The suffocating grip of my PTSD had significantly weakened now that I no longer had to constantly fight a psychological war inside my own home. The rusty anchor was gone, and without its toxic weight dragging me under, I had discovered that I could breathe on my own. I was finally truly in command of my own airspace. Major Sarah Miller had personally overseen the furnishing of the office. On the shelf behind my chair sat a framed photograph of Task Force Echo 27 operators standing in full combat gear in front of a Black Hawk helicopter, every face obscured by tactical masks except mine. Beside it, a smaller frame held the folded American flag from Corporal Davis's funeral, a permanent reminder of the cost of the freedom I defended. Sarah had also placed a single potted plant on the windowsill, the first living thing I had been responsible for that did not require a weapon. It was green, healthy, and thriving under my watch, proof that I could nurture something without a mission directive telling me how. I casually glanced at the live video feed broadcasting from the heavily fortified base's front gate security camera, a secondary monitor mounted on the wall beside my desk, displaying 4 high-definition angles of the perimeter. Richard stood outside the razor wire fence, desperately clutching a wrinkled, heavily stained manila envelope. His snorts looked visibly aged by a decade. His hair was thinning in patches, his posture permanently hunched, as if the weight of his own shame had physically compressed his spine. The arrogant corporate superiority completely evaporated from his hollow, sunken eyes. He was trying to use the finalized divorce papers as a pathetic, transparent excuse to get past the armed guards to see me, a desperate, final attempt to manipulate my pity and latch back onto my rising power like a parasite seeking a new host. He had not changed. He was simply out of ammunition. I pressed the red intercom button on my desk, connecting directly to the heavily armed gate sentries. "Kick him out." I ordered, my voice devoid of any human emotion, flat and final as a steel door closing. "If he ever shows his face here again, arrest him for trespassing on a military base." Through the security monitor, I watched with cold satisfaction as 2 towering military police officers physically escorted him away from the steel gates. Richard resisted for exactly 2 seconds before the sheer physical size of the MPs convinced him otherwise. They released him on the public sidewalk, and he stumbled, dropping the manila envelope into a puddle. He stood there staring at the gates for a long moment, a broken man looking at a fortress he would never enter before turning and shuffling away down the cracked public sidewalk. I looked down at the duplicate set of divorce documents resting on my massive oak desk. The papers arranged with the same precision I applied to operational briefings. I picked up my heavy fountain pen and slashed my signature across the dotted line without a microsecond of hesitation, executing the action with the same decisive pressure I used to authorize tactical strikes. The ink was dark, permanent, and final. I pressed the pen down on the period after my last name with enough force to dimple the heavy paper, then set the pen down with a precise click against the oak surface. Colonel Amber Jackson, not Mrs. Richard Jackson. Not the logistics clerk, not the battered wife hiding scars under cheap foundation. The woman who signed that document was the same woman who had signed execution orders for 5 transnational terror networks. I slid the completed papers into a standard civilian envelope, sealing it with crisp precision, and dropped it into my personal outbox. At that exact moment, my encrypted satellite phone rang, breaking the quiet of the office. It was Grace Thompson, the civilian mother of a young hostage my Tier 1 team had violently extracted from a terrorist stronghold just 12 hours prior. Her voice broke into heavy, uncontrollable sobs as she repeatedly thanked me for bringing her only son back alive. She called me an angel. She called me a hero. A genuine, profound, and deeply healing sense of peace washed over my entire body, settling into my bones like warm sunlight, reaching frozen ground. This was the purpose the rusty anchor had tried to drown. This was the reason I survived the battlefield, not to be caged by a coward, but to bring other people's children home. I hung up the secure phone feeling lighter than I had in 15 years, and looked at the exact center of my immaculate desk. Resting there on a navy blue velvet pad was a heavily embossed classified letter bearing the official presidential seal, its gold foil catching the morning light. My confirmed, heavily vetted promotion to brigadier general. The trauma of the past no longer required a toxic, rusty civilian anchor to hold me down in the dirt. I had built my own foundation, my own fortress, my own version of peace that no one could take from me because no one had given it to me. I picked up my customized matte black sidearm from the desk drawer and smoothly racked the heavy steel slide. Clack, clack. The metallic sound was crisp, deadly, and breathtakingly beautiful. It was no longer the terrifying sound of my nighttime flashbacks, the sound that used to jolt me awake in cold sweat while Richard snored beside me, oblivious and useless. It was the commanding anthem of an unstoppable, invincible force who had turned 15 years of suffering into an unbreakable legacy. The ghost was dead, the general had arrived. If this journey of turning deep trauma into untouchable power inspired you, please like the video and subscribe for more true stories of resilience. Do not forget to share your own moments of breaking free in the comments below, because your strength might just be the light someone else needs today.